All right, guys, today I'm going to be going over negative reinforcement. And we can make this super complex. We could also make it very, very simple. You can be a very competent dog trainer and not understand fully the definition of negative reinforcement. Right? People have been training dogs probably for a very long time before the definition of negative reinforcement became widely known. So let's get right to it. Okay, let's cut the fluff and let's get right into it. Negative reinforcement, just that topic alone, is a consequent stimulus. Okay, let's start with that. Negative reinforcement is a consequent stimulus. Let's dive into that a little bit. This means that this is a result of an event. That's what a consequent stimulus means, okay? It's the result of an event. Consequent, we understand what that is, right? If you speak English, you understand what consequent means. Stimulus, all stimulus means is anything that can be detected by the senses. So if you can hear it, you can smell it, you can touch it, it's a stimulus. So it's a consequent stimulus. Let's start with that super simple. This means it happens after the fact. All right? It doesn't happen before, it happens after. Additionally, it's a consequent stimulus that increases the rate of a behavior. So if we look at a behavior and we mathematically go, how can we make this behavior go up in frequency? That's what negative reinforcement is. It is one of the strategies that is a consequence, meaning it happens after. And as a result of that, it increases the frequency or the rate of a behavior. So if we can grab behavior X and we go, how can we make that behavior X multiply? How can we make it happen more frequently? Negative reinforcement is a consequence that can make X happen more often. Now, real brief break here. This is where people get confused with punishment. Because when people think of punishment and negative reinforcement, a lot of times they're using it interchangeably and they're conflating the two. They're thinking it's the same thing. Because here's the thing, a leash or a collar can be used for both. I don't want to get into a lot of detail here, but I just want to give you a little bit of that. Okay, so a leash can be used as positive punishment, and the leash could also be used as negative reinforcement. It is the application, but not only the application, but even more importantly, it is the result of that application that dictates what it is that you're using. So if we look at behavior X, can we make behavior X happen more often with a leash in this example? If the answer is yes, then we're engaging in negative reinforcement. Okay, so let's continue on with our definition, then we'll give some examples of negative reinforcement. You don't need to know this, by the way, okay? I said earlier, you could be very competent without knowing this. This is just it's nice to be aware. It's nice to know, to understand what it is. If you're a dog owner listening to this, you're not a dog trainer, you just like your dog and you're very involved in the training of your dog. This probably doesn't mean anything to you, but it helps you understand depending on how involved you are. I know clients, they could not care less as to what the definitions are. They just want their dogs to behave. They want their dogs to do better. That's all that matters ultimately. I'm not having these discussions with my clients. But let's get back to the topic. Negative reinforcement, a quick reminder, a quick review, is a consequent stimulus that increases the frequency or the rate of a behavior. Okay? Now, how does that happen? Well, negative reinforcement, the word negative does not mean bad. Okay? The word negative does not mean bad. It doesn't mean unpleasant. This is the problem with the word negative. It has such a negative connotation, no pun intended. That's such a negative connotation that we emotionally get involved in this term, and we already, we flush it down the toilet like it's already a bad thing. So negative in this particular instance does not mean unpleasant. Negative is more of a mathematical equation. What it means is it means subtraction. Okay, it means it's being taken away. Think of this as mathematics, simple math. And don't think of it as pleasant or unpleasant. So how does this apply? How does this happen? How does negative reinforcement apply? We're going to have some examples. Well, negative reinforcement, meaning there is something that gets taken away that makes the dog go, I should do more of that, so that goes away. Okay? When presented with this equation, if I do X behavior, this thing goes away, which then makes me want to do more of X. And remember, it makes X increase in frequency, X being the behavior. So here is a more specific example. Let's say the behavior, this is super simple. Do not overcomplicate it in your head. Just follow along with me. A very simple exercise, a very simple behavior like sitting, okay? Butt on the ground, just a regular simple sit. How can we negative reinforce a sit? Okay? We're not talking about whether it's right or it's wrong, what the better option would be, or how you did it with your dog, or how you normally do it. We're simply using the example to illustrate what negative reinforcement is. So sit is the X behavior we've been talking about. Okay. How do we make sit increase in frequency through negative reinforcement? Okay. Remember, it's a consequence. And also the word negative means something gets taken away. So here is what happens. Follow along with me. Dog is hanging out. I'm getting ready for my training session. The leash is attached to my dog's collar. What collar that is doesn't matter. It could be a flat collar. It could be a martingale collar. It could be a rope collar. It could be like a slip collar. It could be a prong collar. It doesn't matter. Leash is attached to a dog's collar. Okay? I'm getting ready for my training session. I'm getting ready to implement sit through negative reinforcement. What I do here is there is a form of pressure in an upwards direction on the leash. Okay? So I have the leash attached to the dog's collar and I'm pulling up. I'm not yanking up. I'm just simply applying upwards pressure. And maybe I'm pushing the butt down as well. Now we have a form of pressure that is happening. This is also assuming in this example that the dog maybe doesn't even understand what that is. Okay, so I'm pushing the butt down. So there's pressure there. There is some pressure on the leash. And now the dog is going, what is happening here? And then when the dog follows the lead, okay, basically the dog goes, okay, I think what I'm supposed to do is, okay, my butt's being pushed, my neck is being pulled in an upwards direction. Okay, so the most natural thing to do here for the dog, this is an example. Don't go crazy thinking that doesn't work. Okay, it's an example. And then the dog goes, you know what? Let me put my butt on the ground. So the moment the butt goes on the ground, which is a sit, okay, X behavior, the pressure goes away. Here's the subtraction. Here's the negative part of the equation. So the pressure on the leash and the butt go away. So as that pressure goes away, now we have the negative. This is the thing that got subtracted. The consequent stimulus, was the pressure went away when X behavior or a sit happened. So this is repetition number 1. Now, what you choose to do afterwards, if you want to pet the dog, okay, any of that, whatever you want to do afterwards, that doesn't matter, okay? In this specific example, to illustrate negative reinforcement, what happens afterwards, whether you pet the dog, feed the dog, that's not what we're putting our focus on. But we finished that exercise. We finished that repetition. Dog goes, okay, I put my butt on the ground, pressure went away. Then what we do is we repeat the exercise. We do this again. And the reason we do this again is because, like anything, in order for an animal to learn a skill, you need, what do you need? You need frequency. You need repetition, right? You need practice, 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 practice. Okay, this is with anything, anybody. You need to do something more than once for you to acquire the skill of this particular behavior. So we do repetition number 2. We do the same thing. The dog gets upwards pressure on the leash. The hand goes on the butt gets pressure downwards. The leash gets pressure upwards. Now there's this moment of pressure that is taking place. The dog is going, what's going on? Okay, butt on the ground. Pressure goes away. That's the consequent stimulus. As a result of the butt hitting the ground, we get excited. You can pet the dog, whatever you do. And then we start again. We start again right after. And by repetition number 4, 5, maybe 10, depending on the dog, a repetition between 5 and 10, what you will notice is it'll very likely get easier. It'll very likely get easier. So how does it get easier? Well, it depends on the dog, but typically some of the signs, some of the indicators that it's getting easier is you'll notice that you're not pushing the butt quite as much, or it doesn't take as long for the dog to put their butt on the ground. Okay, so the dog is now starting to formulate a pattern. They're starting to observe, they're starting to notice. They see this. Okay, the past 10 repetitions, I've been put in the same situation, and every time my butt goes on the ground, the pressure goes away. So as a consequence of my butt hitting the ground, the pressure is going away. So what happens is it makes the sit behavior more likely to happen again in the future. Now, if we add dozens and dozens and dozens of repetitions, and I'm not suggesting we do this in one session. Session number 1 might be 10 repetitions. Then maybe a few hours later, maybe another 10, 20 repetitions, right? If we do it over and over and over and over, that's not a bad session. That's fairly quick. Session number 3 could be a few hours later, or it could be the next day. And then you stack these sessions, you stack these repetitions. When you get to the hundreds over a period of time, the dog really gets an idea as to what is happening. Then from that point forward, I don't want to get too in depth into training because I don't want to get derailed from the topic. But then, later as you start to pair up your verbal cue and all of that stuff, well, the dog then learns, okay, here is what I'm supposed to do. This is what happens when I sit. The pressure goes away when I sit. And now this is how you are implementing negative reinforcement to increase the frequency and the rate of the sit behavior. Okay? That, in a nutshell, that's what negative reinforcement is. You probably have done this a bunch of times. If you've done something similar to this, it might not be the sit, it might be something else. Anything where there was some sort of pressure to encourage the dog to do a behavior. Okay, so the difference between between negative reinforcement and positive punishment is what the goal is, right? What ends up happening. So if I use pressure to encourage the dog, to push the dog into a behavior, we could simplify that and say that was a use of pressure in the context of negative reinforcement. If a similar form of pressure is used, and what ends up happening is the behavior goes away, so the behavior decreases in frequency. So X behavior happens less often, less frequently, or it gets completely eliminated. This would be pressure used in the context of punishment or positive punishment specifically. That is where people get a little bit confused, is where they go, well, technically I'm using the leash and I'm pushing the butt down. I'm punishing the dog. It depends on how you're looking at it and what target behavior you are actually trying to work on. Now I'm gonna throw in a couple of wrenches here into our definition and into our explanation, because I know there are people, I've had these discussions with trainers before, which shouldn't be a discussion. It's pretty black and white, but the human mind is pretty interesting. We like to overcomplicate things. So what I've heard people say is, well, Will, technically, when you are doing that, you are punishing the dog for standing. And so they go, well, you see, there's like a gotcha point, right? Like a gotcha question. Well, aren't you punishing the dog for standing because you're making the standing not happen? Well, the problem here is we're putting the sit on cue. Essentially, that's kind of the goal, is to put the sit on cue, right? We want to make it happen on cue. Additionally, we're not trying to get rid of standing. We're not trying to say standing is bad. The standing just happens to be how you are. We're not trying to punish that. We're not trying to go, we don't like it when you stand. Or we're not trying to go, you're standing, that's awful. Because technically, okay, think about this. If I was trying to punish the act of standing, then I wouldn't care whether the dog sits or downs. I wouldn't be specific about what the alternative is. I would just be like, don't stand. Okay? Whereas positive punishment, which we can make a video about this, or another podcast about this, but whereas positive punishment is more specific, and there is no end goal on the other side. But in negative reinforcement, we have a specific goal, behavior X. Okay, X is the specific. This is the behavior we're trying to increase in frequency. If I go to the other side and I go to positive punishment, behavior X would be the behavior that we're trying to get rid of, would be the behavior that we're trying to decrease. Okay, so there are specifics there. It's not just broad, well, you're technically punishing this, that, and the other. No, we are actually being very specific about what we want. In this particular case, it's the butt on the ground. Now, we're not saying sit means don't stand. It just means put your butt on the ground, more specifically. Because if sit was don't stand, that wouldn't matter what the dog does. Okay, I don't want to throw too big of a wrench into our definition here, because I don't want to add some confusion, but I do want to make it a little bit broad. Okay, not too broad, but a little bit broad, so that way the definition makes sense long term. So that way you understand as you're listening to this, if you happen to get confused by the whole dilemma of punishment, is it punishment or is it negative reinforcement? Okay, simply stated, I'm going to repeat it. We're going to review this. What this means is a consequent stimulus, okay, increases the rate of X behavior. The pressure is part of the strategy. The other thing I've heard from people is people that are confused about this, they'll say, well, Will, you're adding the pressure. How is that negative? How is that subtracting? Well, the adding of the pressure in this context is not part of the equation. This is more of a, or rather, it's not part of the consequent stimulus. The pressure is there, okay? The consequence of putting the butt on the ground, that is what we're targeting. The consequence of X behavior, that is what makes, remember, it happens after, okay? That's what a consequence is. The butt on the ground causes a consequence where the pressure goes away. That's what made a negative reinforcement. That's the topic for today. That's what I wanted to expand on. If you think you want me to add a little bit more to this definition, let me know in the comments. If you want me to go over other topics or some of the other quadrants, let me know, and we will discuss this in more detail in terms of the other parts of the quadrants. If you like this video, if you like this podcast, do me a huge favor. Support the channel. Share it with somebody else. Hit the like button. If you're watching this on YouTube, hit the subscribe button. And I'll see you guys in the next episode.